Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel once again. Today we are going to look at the case of the Grim Slipper. So up there on the one that's on screen, you can see the rest of my cases. My social media profiles are listed below if you'd like to follow me. And with nothing else to say, let's get started. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was born on August 30th, 1952 in Los Angeles, United States. He was raised in the South Central area, the same place where he would commit his crimes years later. There is no information about his family composition or what his early years of life were like. In fact, the first thing we know about him is that after finishing high school, he joined the American Army. And while we don't have details about how his career developed there, we know that by 1974, Lonnie was sent to Stuttgart, a city in West Germany where the United States had troops. Since the end of World War II, when, with the defeat of the Nazis, the country was divided into several occupation zones, with Stuttgart falling to the United States. At 22 years old, while patrolling the city at night by car with two of his companions, they saw a 17-year-old girl who they found attractive. With the excuse of needing help to get to an address, they stopped the vehicle and asked her for directions. Recognizing that they were soldiers and without the intention of causing trouble, the young girl kindly responded to them. And for that very reason, when they offered to drive her home as a thank you, she accepted. However, once she got into the car, the soldiers threatened her with a knife so she wouldn't scream while they drove to a more secluded place away from the center. Once there, they took turns abusing her, taking several photos for their later use. Soon the girl realized that she was not going to get out of that car alive if she resisted or tried to escape, so she chose another plan. She started to pretend that she liked it. Lonnie, she flirted with him and even asked for a phone number so they could meet alone. This supposed interest in Lonnie made her companions decide to stop abusing her, and instead they took her home. From there, the girl called the police to report what had just happened. Identifying the soldiers was not complicated, so all three were arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison each. Although Lonnie was released early due to his good behavior, something we've seen quite a bit on this channel and we know it doesn't end well. Of course, this incident led to him being officially dishonorably discharged from the American Army. On July 24, 1975, just a few days after regaining his freedom. At 23 years old and with nothing else to do in Stuttgart, he returned to South Central. Despite the fact that he had literally been discharged from the army for abusing a girl, this did not seem to be an obstacle for him to rebuild his life. Without much trouble, he got a job as a mechanic for the Los Angeles Police Department, where he spent a good number of years, until he found another job as a garbage collector. During that time, he met a woman named Sylvia, with whom he married and with whom he had 2 children over the years. By then, he appeared to have fully reformed, becoming an exemplary husband and father. His neighbors considered him a great man, as he always seemed willing to help whoever needed it, even children. It was common for the younger kids in the neighborhood to go to his house to get help fixing their bikes. So imagine the image others had of him. He really was a very good neighbor for people who knew him outside of his home. Lonnie was really good, although his children never thought the same. According to what they declared several years later, Lonnie was not as kind to them as he was to his surroundings. In fact, he brutally beat them for the most ridiculous reasons. He got angry easily and always took it out on them. And although this in itself was horrible, it was far from the worst thing this man did. The second half of the 80s was a rather complicated time for South Central. At that time, violence had increased considerably due to 2 major reasons. There were gangs and drugs in particular. We're talking about crack. The increasing consumption and sale of illegal substances like that by gangs had a direct impact on the violence in the area, which increased due to conflicts between the groups. Quite quickly, South Central became a dangerous place where homicides were extremely common, and while at first it was only attributed to the gangs, it was not something that was exclusively their fault. People like Lonnie had started to take advantage of the wave of violence to fulfill their darkest fantasies and disguise what Lonnie was doing. He started to stalk. He would take his car and go to the most dangerous areas of the city to get closer to women of all ages who, like him, were of African descent. And he would start talking to them. It was always about women in vulnerable situations, either because they offered sexual services for money or because they were addicted to illegal substances. These women were more susceptible to certain deceptions. He promised them good pay, food, or even drugs. The first woman he managed to deceive in this way was Deborah Jackson on the night of August 10, 1985. This 29-year-old woman and mother of two, he picked her up on the streets of a neighborhood called Vermont, Slauson from South Central, which in itself is characterized as an area where, for the most part, only people of African descent live. It was quite late when Deborah left her friend's apartment and headed to the bus stop to get home. However, she never arrived. While she was waiting for the bus, a car stopped and offered to take her home, which she obviously didn't do. The next day, this woman's body would be found in an abandoned alley. She had received 3 gunshots to the chest and had also been sexually assaulted multiple times. The case severely impacted the population of South Central, but not the police. For some time now, the Los Angeles Police Department had begun to consider the possibility that there was at least one serial killer operating in the southern part of the city. And Deborah's death made them even more convinced of the theory. After a month of investigation, without making any progress, they concluded that she had been a victim of the serial killer they referred to as the Southside Slayer. The killer from the Southside. According to the information handled by the authorities, this criminal was responsible for stabbing and strangling 13 women who were involved in sex work between 1983 and 1985, with Deborah's being considered one of these. Popularly, these crimes began to be known as the Strawberry Murders, or in Spanish, the Strawberry Crimes, since strawberry was a term used to name sex workers. This became a much more serious issue when, in September of 1985, the authorities of the Los Angeles Police Department held a conference to request collaboration from the people. Did they hope to get some kind of clue this way about who was behind the attacks? However, the investigation didn't seem very serious. It seemed more like the police were more occupied with the case of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, another serial killer who had started to attack in 1984 and was still active at that time. In the Los Angeles and San Francisco area, one must take into account the time, culture, and place where all this is happening. Because, unlike the victims of the Southside Slayer, Richard Ramirez's victims were what were known as good people. And many believed that the authorities cared more about Richard Ramirez's victims than those from South Central, because they were black women, low-income, prostitutes, and often also addicts. An accusation that the authorities obviously publicly denied several times, stating that they were handling both cases equally, although the investigation of the Southside Slayer seemed much slower. For a year, the police sought any kind of information about the individual responsible for the death of 13 women, but no clear clue was obtained. By the beginning of 1986, the authorities of the Los Angeles Police Department were set to increase the reward. They went from offering $10,000 to anyone who collaborated with the investigation to offering $25,000 in an attempt to get more citizen participation. While they were still investigating the death of Deborah and other women, on August 12, 1986, they found the lifeless body of another woman on the streets of South Central. Just like in Deborah's case, this woman, who was identified as Henrietta Wright, 35 years old, had been shot in the chest twice. When she was found, she was barefoot and had been covered with a blanket while she had some sort of gag in her mouth. The bullet casings were not there. Next to her, on the floor of the same alley, a man named Thomas Sylvester Steele was found. the only male victim of this man, who, according to investigators' theories, had been murdered for trying to help Henrietta, suffering the same fate as her. The police began to notice that this second homicide, while it coincided with Deborah's death and how she had been found, did not have as many similarities with the rest of the 13 women who had actually been strangled or stabbed. This, along with the initial conflicting descriptions of the alleged killer, led detectives to believe that they were not dealing with a single serial killer, but several. Focusing on this theory, all the evidence that had been collected since 1985 was analyzed. This allowed them to conclude that at least 4 individuals had been involved in the deaths of those 15 women. There was no doubt that Deborah and Henrietta had been victims of the same individual, and in 1987, 3 more women joined them. The first victim of this serial killer that year was Barbara Ware, a 23-year-old girl who was found on January 10th in an alley with several garbage containers. Her body was hidden under a pile of waste. Just like in the case of the other 2 women, Barbara had been shot in the chest and had been sexually abused. On April 15th of that same year, 26-year-old Bernita Sparks left her home at night. Before leaving the house where she lived with her mother, she said she was going to get cigarettes, but she never came back. Her body was found inside a dumpster. She had been abused, beaten, and strangled, but the cause of death was a gunshot to the chest. The next crime would occur a few months later, on Halloween. Like so many other young people, Mary Lowe had planned to go to a theme party, so she told her mother she would go to one. Unfortunately, that would be the last time she would be seen alive. The next day, her body was found in another alley in the South area. Like the previous victims, she had been shot in the chest. The modus operandi was clearly the same. The bullet wounds of all the girls corresponded to a .25 caliber pistol, with which their attacker finished them off. The lack of blood at the places where they were found let the police know that they were not murdered there, but the perpetrator discarded them in trash alleys or behind bushes, even though they knew he picked them up from the streets of South Central and drove them to a remote area where he abused them and murdered them. They had no solid clues about the killer's identity, and that allowed him to keep killing women as if nothing. The 30th of January, 1988, the 22-year-old Jefferson girl was found in another alley. The characteristics of her death matched the serial killer they had been looking for since 1985, the 11th of September. 18-year-old Alicia Alexander took her keys and some money before approaching her father to ask if he needed anything from the liquor store. When the man responded, she left the house to head to the place, but she never came back. The police searched for her for days, unsuccessfully. They thought she might have run away, but unfortunately they discovered that this was not the case, but that she had been murdered. Her body was found in an alley with several gunshot wounds. The social pressure was growing increasingly, the community of people of color and all. South Central was demanding that the police finally catch this killer who had been hunting the streets of the area for years. Police efforts tripled, but it wasn't thanks to them that what was happening was discovered, but because of the only woman who managed to survive this killer. It happened on November 19th of that same year, just 2 months after Alicia's death, as she had been doing all that time. That night, Lonnie took his car and went out for a ride through the streets of South Central in search of a new victim. That's how he came across Enitra Margaret Washington, who was 30 years old and had decided to walk to a friend's house. As he had done on several occasions before, Lonnie pulled his car right next to Enitra and, in an extremely friendly tone, offered to take her to her destination. Equally polite, the woman declined the offer, just like all the African American women living in South Central at that time. Enitra was aware of the danger that existed, considering there was a serial killer on the loose, so she preferred not to take any risks and continue on her way. Something that the driver of the car didn't like, not in the slightest. To which he replied, "That's what happens to you black women, people can't be nice." This comment made Enitra change her mind. Instead of continuing to walk away, the woman decided to accept what was offered. The driver's comment made her realize that she had been on the defensive for no clear reason. and she felt sorry for having spoken ill to someone who had only tried to be kind, so she got in the car and gave him the address. Now I see this, even now there are many people who, out of kindness, do not say no. And this is a big mistake, as Nitra's decision at that time was terrible. Lonnie started driving, but he didn't take the route to the direction that Enitra had given him. Instead, he led her to a quite remote area. Before the woman could do anything, the man pulled out a gun and shot her in the chest, threatening to do it again if she tried to leave. Meanwhile, Enitra was trying to stop the blood and begging him to let her go to a hospital. Donnie drove to an alley where he forcibly stripped her of all her clothes and started taking pictures of her. Before he began to abuse her while they were still in the car. After a while of him abusing her and due to the blood loss, Enitra was barely conscious. So the man took her out of the car and left her in the alley before leaving her to die there. Incredibly, Enitra didn't die. With the little strength she had left, she crawled from the alley to the street where she began to ask for help. When she woke up, she was in a hospital. From the beginning, the police approached her to get her statement. Her testimony was key to knowing what the killer looked like and to make a composite sketch with which to search for him. The sketch was circulated in the media and all over the area, but no one seemed to recognize the man, despite that some traces of the attacker's DNA had been collected from Nitra's body. These samples didn't prove to be very useful. They did confirm that the man who had attacked her was the killer who had ended the lives of the previous women. When searched in the criminal records, there was no match. And what about? Lonnie had been in prison for the gang rape of a girl, but this had happened in Germany, so he was not registered as a sex offender in his country. The fact that one of his victims had survived and had also been able to describe him to the police, it seemed to be too risky for Lonnie, who entered a very long period of inactivity. We're talking about 14 years, during which the police completely lost track of him. During that decade and a half, the police tried to uncover his identity, but it seemed to be impossible. The Grim Slipper, as he was nicknamed for his long period of inactivity, seemed impossible to identify. While the authorities were aware that they had not been able to catch the Grim Slipper, the population of South Central began to slowly forget about the disturbing series of unsolved crimes. It was in December of 2001 when his figure reappeared in the local media. Specifically after the 21st of that month when Princess Bertomeu, a 15-year-old girl, disappeared. For months, her case was front-page news in all the media. The teenager was tirelessly searched for by the police, without really knowing what had happened to her. It was only on March 9, 2002 that they found her, unfortunately, already deceased. Her body was found in a hidden alley behind some bushes. She had been beaten and strangled, but the way and the place where she had been discovered caught the attention of the oldest detectives. Did it remind them a lot of the Grim Sleeper? The local press had also come to this same conclusion. The modus operandi reminded them of the killer from the 80s, and quickly that hypothesis became public, terrifying the entire area. With the pressure back on them, the police made the decision to remove the doubt immediately. Comparing samples that had been found on Princess's body with those of previous victims attributed to the Grim Sleeper. After a fortnight, their doubts were validated. The killer had struck again, and in the summer of 2003, he did it again. On July 11th, the body of 35-year-old Valerie McCorvey was found in one of the alleys of South Central. Just like in Princess's case, Valerie had been beaten and strangled as well as sexually abused. It had many similarities with Princess's case. Interviewing the woman's environment, they discovered that she had an extremely toxic relationship with her ex-partner, and for a while they considered him the main suspect. However, upon reanalyzing the evidence, they discovered a male DNA sample that matched the one found on Princess's body and the other victims. So the hypothesis was ruled out. Grim Slipper had returned, and, as in the first investigation, there doesn't seem to be clear ways to catch him. Over the next 4 years, catching this serial killer became essential for the Los Angeles Police Department. But that didn't mean they were successful. The killer went back into a period of inactivity that ended on the first day of January 2007. When a homeless man discovered a new body, it was Janicia Peters, 25 years old. Unlike the other 2 recent victims, Janicia had been shot both in her back and in her chest. Through the saliva remains collected on Janicia's body, the police were able to connect her murder with those of 11 other women in Los Angeles, the first being in 1985. However, despite attempts to find a match in the state and federal criminal databases, no match was found. Were they just as far away as before catching Grim Sleeper? The police still had no clear clues about the identity of this killer. So, in September of 2008, they decided to increase the reward they were offering in exchange for some kind of information. From $25,000, it went up to $50,000 in an attempt to reach more people. In November of that year, the case appeared on the television program America's Most Wanted as a way to keep the case present in the minds of the population, and with some luck encourage someone to come forward to the authorities. However, this strategy also lacked success. The few people who had said they had information about the case were either lying or the information was so little that it did not allow for any serious progress in the investigation. So for the next 2 years, they continued to focus on DNA samples, although searching national data containers proved to make no progress. So in 2010, after a series of failed attempts, a technique that was just being applied to cases like this was tried. Basically, it was about genetic genealogy, that is, searching in the collected DNA samples for certain family markers that could match other people. In other words, search through these samples for matches with other people who were related to the owner of the DNA profile. It was thanks to this technique that they found Christopher Franklin, who had been convicted by the court in 2009 for theft. And as the law stated, before being sent to jail, his fingerprints and a DNA sample were taken for the criminal database. The match between his sample and that of the Grim Sleeper was extremely high, which meant they had a direct relationship. But what was the problem? That in 85 Christopher was a baby, so he was not the killer. Rather, it was his father. Although to confirm it, they needed a sample from Lonnie, but they didn't want the suspect to feel pursued and lose track of him. So they devised a plan to obtain his DNA. At this point, Lonnie was working as a garbage collector, and part of his routine was always eating at the same bar. So the police decided to send an undercover officer as a waiter to the place to serve him and thus collect several items that could have his DNA. Like a leftover piece of pizza, a piece of dessert that Lonnie had left unfinished, a fork, 2 used napkins, and a plastic cup. Samples were extracted from all these objects and compared with those obtained over the years from the victims of the Grim Sleeper. The answer in each of the tests was accurate. Lonnie David Franklin was the Grim Sleeper. On July 7, 2010, at the age of 57, Lonnie was arrested on charges of 10 murders. When the house he shared with his wife was searched, the police found that behind a wall, the accused kept more than 180 photos of naked women, almost all of them black, ranging from adolescence to old age. Within that huge amount of images, many belonged to the 10 victims that were known to him, but there were many others that the police could not identify. So it was decided to publish these photos to ask for the help of the citizens. Within a few weeks, the police managed to identify Ayla Marshall, Rolinia Morris, Sharon Dismuke, Ines Warren, and Georgia Thomas, discovering that all of them had disappeared during Lonnie's periods of activity and had never been found. Despite there being good evidence against him, the trial was delayed for various reasons for 6 years until it finally began on February 16, 2016. With complete calm, Lonnie pleaded not guilty, but the ballistic evidence, DNA, and Enitra's testimony were more than enough for no one to believe his statement. After several plea hearings, on May 4th, the jury retired from the court to deliberate. They gave their verdict the next day, finding Lonnie guilty of all charges and suggested the death penalty for the criminal. On August 10th, the Los Angeles Superior Court decided to heed and sentenced him to death. However, as is known, this process is not carried out immediately. So Lonnie was sent to San Quentin prison to enter what we know as death row, where he was for 4 years. Since on March 28th of 2020, the prison officials found him dead in his cell. He was 67 years old, and according to the autopsy results, he died due to natural causes. The specific cause was never disclosed, for which he had died. While he had been tried for 10 murders to date, authorities believe his victim count may have been much higher. Even though he spent 10 years in prison, it's hard to think that justice was served in this case. So well, this is where we end the story of the Grim Sleeper. Had you heard about this case before? You can tell me in the comments below. And so we come to the end. Here are the Patreons and channel members. Thank you for supporting me through these platforms. And with nothing else to say, here is a new video, here is a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face, and see you in another video. Goodbye.